Welcome everyone to the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about IT planning and budgeting. Just a few tips before we get started. If you can please ask questions via chat, we encourage you all to do that. Also, we will be asking you all to respond to a few polls, so please give your feedback, and if possible, avoid multitasking. We often get asked whether we're going to be providing the recording afterwards, so yes, we will be providing both the recording and the slides afterwards, so don't worry about taking too many notes. Just a little bit about Community IT Innovators. We provide IT support to nonprofits in the Washington, D.C. area, and we help them to address both their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters, Johan Hammerstrom, who is the Chief Operating Officer, and Matthew Eshleman, who is the Chief Technology Officer.
All right, thank you very much, Roshni, and welcome to everyone here joining us this afternoon for the webinar. We're happy to have you with us. And as Roshni mentioned, we're going to be talking about IT planning today. So we're going to get that started. So we're going to be covering four sort of larger areas related to IT planning. The first is governance, and before you hit the cancel button to get out of the webinar, we promise to keep that relatively short, and we're going to specifically talk about governance in the context of IT planning and sort of the critical importance that governance issues play in having a successful IT planning process. From there, we'll move on and talk a little bit more about strategy and how you can build and incorporate a successful strategy into your IT planning, and also how you can align your planning process with your overall organizational strategy. An important part of any IT planning process is to understand what you currently have in place in your organization with regards to information technology. And so assessing the current state of your IT is also a very important part of IT planning. And then finally, we'll discuss some sort of concrete budget guidelines, some tangible factors that you can that you want to keep in mind, and that can also be used sort of as a tool for helping you put together an IT budget, which is kind of in some ways, the concrete, deliverable or end result of an IT planning process. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about governance here. And oh, actually, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Matt. Cool. So before we get into that, though, I did want to have this one kind of affirmation. And sometimes, if you're the only person responsible for IT in your organization, or even if you're, part of a small IT team in a larger organization, it can be hard to kind of, explain to others the value of technology. And I think that the first thing to recognize in any IT planning process is that technology is important. And as our world becomes, increasingly dominated by information technology, it's increasingly important for organizations to have good IT planning and good IT strategy in order for them to succeed. So we're happy that all of you could join us today, and we just wanted to kind of affirm that for you. And a part of what we're going to be covering in this webinar today is ways that you can kind of take that understanding of the importance of technology and share that with the rest of your organization and get other people in the organization on board with the IT planning process. So before we get started, we kind of want to get a sense of the size of organizations that are represented. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. Just let us know how many staff are in your organization. The organization either that you represent, or if you're a consultant, organizations that you typically work with. And it's looking like we have a pretty even distribution. about a third in each category. No one here from an organization with over 100 staff, but it's about a third from each category. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of speak to the needs of each kind of size profile that's represented here, and certainly ask questions as we go along using the question box. So let's talk a little bit about governance. So what do we mean by governance? And I pulled this definition from the IT Governance Institute, and they revised their definition of IT governance back in last year, 2012. And they said that governance are the essentials that ensure that IT sustains and extends the mission of the organization. So good governance means that certain essential factors are in place such that IT can support and extend the mission of the organization. So what are those essential factors? Well, it kind of boils down to three things. First, leadership. Leadership is critical, and if leadership is not on board on some level with the understanding that IT is important, if leadership is not engaged on some level with the IT planning process, then it's unlikely to succeed. It's certainly unlikely to succeed on sort of a bigger picture strategic level, but it's also potentially likely to fail on more of a tactical operational level. So leadership needs to be on board, and I realize that that's not always the case. Sometimes you're working in a situation where leadership is not engaged in the process, and we're going to spend a little bit of time later on in the webinar talking about some different ways that you can engage leadership. But if you're responsible for IT planning in any way, you need to include that as kind of one of your critical goals or tasks. You need to get the leadership engaged at some level. Second, you need to have organizational structures that support the proper functioning of IT, support of IT. Someone needs to own IT within the organization. The best way to do that is to actually have a named position like an IT director or a CIO, and certainly in larger organizations, that's an important position to establish and to staff effectively. In small organizations, particularly in the 0 to 20 organizations with less than 20 staff, it's unlikely that you will have someone whose sole responsibility is for IT. Generally, you have people who wear a lot of different hats. But even so, you need to make it, someone needs to be responsible for it, someone with a certain level of managerial authority. So oftentimes, we've seen that work with an office manager or an operations manager, kind of takes IT on. Certainly, it's not uncommon for someone in the finance function of the organization, like a VP of Finance, Director of Finance, to take that on as well. It just needs to be clear, and that person also needs to take that responsibility seriously. And then finally, in order for there to be good governance around IT, you need to have processes in place. And the sophistication of the process really kind of depends on the size and complexity of the organization. So, for a small organization, the processes might be, as simple as we're going to do an assessment 4 months before our budget is due, and then we'll have a meeting to discuss IT priorities 2 months after that, and then the budget will be due 1 month after that. And that's a pretty basic, straightforward process. But having that as an organizational process is really important in making sure that the IT planning happens effectively. As the size and complexity of the organization grows, the processes also become more complicated. And certainly as for larger organizations, starting to get the board involved, the board of directors involved on IT planning at some level is also important for good governance. So these are all critical parts of putting together a successful IT plan. So let's talk a little bit more about what to do if your leadership is disengaged with IT, doesn't care about it, doesn't have time for it, isn't interested in it. What are some things you can do to engage the key decision makers in IT? First and foremost, it's important to educate the leadership in an inclusive way. And what I mean by that is you really want to get them kind of involved in the process. Talk to them using the language they can understand and framing the questions in a way that are meaningful and important to them. So in general, most executive leadership are not going to care about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of the technology itself, in terms of what operating systems you're running, or in terms of what platform your website is hosted on. Those are the kinds of things that may be important in the IT planning process, but talking about IT in that way is not going to lead to greater buy-in from the senior leadership. You need to put it in terms that they understand. So if their primary concern is raising membership, you need to connect the dots between how IT is going to help with that problem or with that challenge. If they have a mandate from the board, you need to know what that is, and you need to understand how IT sort of relates to that. So, it's important to raise IT issues, but it's also important to frame them in a way that, speaks to the level of the executive leadership and to the concerns that they have. So that's important. It's also important to be patient and persistent. Don't think that you're going to have one meeting. Well, first of all, don't assume you're going to get that meeting right away. And when you do, don't assume that what you're trying to discuss with the leadership is going to sink in right away. In general, as with a lot of long-term initiatives or cultural changes, organizational change, it just takes time and it takes persistence. So don't give up on the process, but also don't be surprised if it takes a while. Nothing is nothing works like concrete examples, and so if you can walk your leadership through specific scenarios, that will really drive the message home. So one of the ways that this happens the most with our clients is when we're talking about backup systems. And if you start talking about, well, we need a tape drive, and it's got an RPO of 1 day and an RTO of 2 days, you're not going to get anybody's attention. But if instead you say, well, right now the backup system in place, if it crashes, we'll be down for 2 weeks, and chances, there's a good chance that we'll lose all of the data over 1 month old. So, and at first someone might say, well, what are the chances of that happening? That's not likely to happen. But then you can start to use more specific examples, like, well, there's power outages, there's weather, extreme weather conditions. There's a lot of different things that can happen. So you want to tell some good stories. And all of this kind of gets back to the overall theme here, which is just engage with the leadership. Use other things to talk about technology rather than talking about the technology itself. One last word of caution. Be sure to set realistic expectations. I think it's pretty common in the world of technology to assume that technology is going to solve all of our problems, to put hopes and expectations on a new system that are just not realistic, to assume that a website development project, for example, is going to take the amount of time that you plan for it to take. Chances are it's probably going to take longer, just because that's how those projects often go. So be sure that when you're talking to the leadership, you want to convince them that what you're advocating for, what you're trying to plan for, is valuable and worthwhile. But at the same time, you don't want to oversell technology, because that will, by doing that, you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot for next year's planning process, and you're kind of leaving a bad taste in everyone's mouth when it comes to technology. So that's very important. So I'm curious here how engaged your leadership is in IT decision making. So we'll do a little poll here, kind of see. All right, good. So we got, that's good. It looks like there's one person out there who does not have leadership engaged in IT decision making. The majority are, it's kind of split almost really between very engaged and somewhat engaged. So that's great, great to see. And I think that also kind of reflects a trend that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, if not longer, of nonprofit leadership becoming more engaged in IT and understanding, the importance and the value of IT. So, assuming you have, the governance pieces in place, the next step in the process is to prioritize, and that kind of boils down to strategy. So, how are you going to prioritize the variety of technology initiatives that you need to move forward with in the coming year? And you can think about, the strategic plan or the priorities in two ways. What do you need to do to maintain the status quo? And then what do you need to do on the IT side to keep up with any changes that are happening in the organization? So, for better or for worse, technology requires a certain amount of ongoing investment in order to run effectively over time. And that's kind of, what the status quo is. And so you need to make sure that you're planning for that on an ongoing basis. But then oftentimes organizations in their organizational strategic plan will anticipate or plan for changes that might change the number of staff, might change the types of programs that the organization is engaged in, could change the locations where they're delivering service or trying to advocate, accomplish their mission. It could change the type of constituents they're reaching out to. And all of these things could have a significant impact on the type of IT that is being used by the organization. So it's really important as you begin the IT planning process to consider the strategic plans of the organization. So we're going to have another poll. We're curious how many of you out there have a strategic organizational plan? All right, so about three-quarters have a strategic organizational plan, about a quarter do not. So if you're in the group that has one, I strongly encourage you to get a copy of that and review it. And that's also a great tool for you to use in engaging your leadership. So if leadership is not engaged with IT, the strategic plan is something that they're hopefully very engaged with. And you can use that to kind of put together talking points and, a way to approach your staff. If your organization does not have a strategic plan, then at the very least, what I would suggest is, going to someone who in the leadership role and just asking them, well, what are your priorities? Like, what are you focused on this year? What's the organization focused on in the next 2 to 3 years? How do you see things changing? And we'll often ask that question when we start an engagement. And it's just good to know. That's very helpful information to have as you begin the IT planning process. So we're going to do another quick poll here. We're just curious if you have a strategic IT plan. So your organization might have a strategic plan for the organization. What about the technology function? Do you have a strategic plan for technology? All right, it's flipped. This time around, we have about three-quarters. And hopefully, anyway, this time around, we have about three-quarters that don't have a strategic IT plan and 1/4 that do. And I think that's pretty common. I mean, generally, the organization puts a lot of effort into coming up with its strategic plan, but not as much effort into coming up with the strategic technology plan. And I think this is an area where if you're responsible for the IT in the organization, it kind of falls on you to put this, the strategic IT plan together. And you want to use the strategic organizational plan as a starting point, and then kind of going back to, the question of what's changing and what's, remaining the same is a nice starting point for, putting together that plan. So in order to answer that question, the next step is to really assess what you have how do you determine what you have now in terms of technology and whether it's currently meeting the organizational needs? So we always recommend going through some kind of assessment process. When you start that process, you need to know, what your capacity is for doing the assessment, whether you need to bring in someone from the outside or whether you want to bring in someone from the outside to do that assessment for you. If there's someone in the organization who owns IT, they can certainly be charged with putting an assessment together. And at the beginning of that process, once again, you want to make sure you set expectations about, the assessment and what will result from the assessment. Like what's the goal of doing an IT assessment? As part of the assessment process, it definitely helps to review the budget to actuals from the previous year. So, how much did the organization budget for IT in the previous year? What was the actual spending like? And that can give you a good sense of, kind of what your run rate is for technology. And certainly for ongoing services like internet, that number should be pretty easy to get and to calculate. You want to talk to staff, if at all possible, as part of the assessment process. Technology in and of itself is obviously very interesting, but it really only has value to the extent that staff can use it to do their work. So you want to talk to staff as part of the assessment process and find out what's working for them and what's not working when it comes to technology. Now, this is an area where you do want to be a little bit careful, and we've all heard stories of, someone coming in and doing a thorough assessment process, and everyone gets interviewed and takes a long time, and then at the end of it, there's a report that's generated and then nothing happens with it. And that actually is worse in some ways than doing nothing at all, because you've raised a lot of expectations, you've created a lot of hype around a technology planning process that ends up not going anywhere. And as with any organizational change, you don't want to burn that capital completely, because the next time you come around talking about IT changes, the first thing out of everyone's mouth is going to be, oh yeah, I remember we did that 2 years ago and nothing came out of it. So you want to be very careful about sort of the PR implications, if you will, of doing these sorts of assessments, but they are very important to conduct. And related to that, you want to keep it going over time. You want to continue. Technology never stands still. Organizations don't stand still. And the technology systems that might have met, your organization's needs 2 or 3 years ago, it's possible that they're not meeting those needs anymore. So it's important to keep the assessment going on an ongoing basis. So some of the different things that you can look at when you're doing the assessment are, I think, first and foremost are your policies. And if you don't have any IT-related policies, that's definitely worth noting, and that's something that you want to incorporate into the IT plan. I think policy more now than before is probably on people's minds, largely because of BYOD, the bring your own device phenomenon that's sweeping the nation is something that is catching a lot of people off guard, and not just small nonprofits, but large multinational corporations are struggling with this issue as well. And so, that's whether or not you allow staff to use their own device to do work, whether or not you require it. Those are all policy issues, and having a written policy that's built into the overall set of organizational policies is important. So you want to look at what policies you have now. Are they current? Are they up to date? And what do they specify? You want to look at your capacity. So does your organization currently have the technology capacity to do the work that it's doing? Internet is a great example of a technology that we don't think about very often. It's kind of just there, especially in this day and age. We just expect to have internet access all the time, everywhere we go. And what people don't realize is, or what they often don't realize, is that internet capacity is kind of a fixed quantity. So you bought that T1 line 7, 8 years ago. Well, the speed hasn't increased. The bandwidth of that T1 line hasn't changed. And unfortunately, the price hasn't changed either in the last 8 or 9 years. It's the same price you paid when you bought it. But your needs as an organization have definitely increased when it comes to bandwidth. With everything moving to the cloud, so to speak, with all of the multimedia, video, and graphics that are now, available and kind of a standard part of using the internet, your typical T1 is no longer anywhere near the capacity you need it to be to do your work. And so, what ends up happening is people say, well, our internet's been getting slower and slower. Well, the reality is the internet hasn't. I mean, the speed has remained the same, but your needs as an organization have been changing. So you want to look at capacity as it relates to every aspect of your technology. Do you have the capacity for the internet? What about drive space? Again, with the advent of multimedia files, communications, and fundraising departments starting to use video and high-definition photography a lot more than they used to, organizations are running out of space on their hard drives. And if you're running out of space on your hard drive, incidentally, you're also running out of space on your backups. And so there's all kinds of capacity issues that result from the amount of space that you're using on your network. Security. Security, very important part. What is your security profile? Hopefully you have some basic security in place. Security is also related to policy. So security issues include things like making sure that you have a good firewall, making sure that you have good content filtering. And this is something that's not very popular, and usually when we bring it up with our clients, they immediately say, well, we don't want to be Big Brother. We're not trying to monitor what people are doing on the internet. But the reality is that email traditionally has been the #1 vector for viruses and malware getting into organizations. But that's no longer the case as much as it used to be. In fact, we had a client about a month ago who got a nasty virus. It took them 3 days to clean up their network. A good half of the organization, I would say, was basically unable to work for about 3 days. And that virus came into the organization through Skype. And so with the advent of a variety of different methods of communicating, like Skype, Dropbox, so forth, we're starting to see a lot more, a greater variety of vectors, and a lot of them are a lot less secured than email has essentially become. So, looking at, security from a lot of different perspectives is really important. I think a lot of small organizations sort of feel like, who cares about us? We're not, no one's going to try to hack into our network. And the reality is that most hacks are not targeted. Most hacks are kind of random hacking events. And whether someone is, deliberately or intentionally trying to do damage to your network, or unintentionally trying to do damage to your network, the end result is the same, which is loss of time and expense and cost of remediation. So definitely keep the security factors in mind. And then finally, don't forget staffing and support. That is also a critical part of any IT system. Keeping IT does take some amount of effort to keep it running, and you want to make sure you have, some support system in place for responding to staff requests, keeping the network, functional. So those are kind of 4 major categories that you can look at to when you're assessing your IT capacity. And if you hire someone from the outside to assess your IT capacity, make sure, your IT, status quo, make sure that they're looking at these different categories as well. Bring them your policies and say, hey, could you review our policies for us? So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to talk a little bit about a simple, straightforward way of mapping your business process.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. I think we've had a really good background and primer on developing the IT assessment approach through looking at policies and kind of organizational capacity. So once you have those things out of the way, you have a good framework and understanding of your organizational culture, what things are important to your organization, do you expect to grow or change in the upcoming year or years. Then it really comes to a time where you need to look at what systems are in place now and how those systems may grow and evolve over time. So I like to use the simple enterprise architecture framework that helps to identify all the different business processes in an organization, and then look at those systems as how they kind of go through the organizational chart in terms of what application is being used by it, what platform that sits on, and then potentially what hardware. So it's also, I think, a good way to approach assessment looking first as the business process so that you can move it away from potentially that kind of technology view first. So this kind of helps you to ask those questions, well, what's important to our organization, what business processes do we have, and then looking at the technology that supports them. And so, for example, let's take a look at this chart filled out. So, for example, most organizations, they'll have their business process. Email is going to be an important function. Perhaps right now that's using an Exchange server that sits on maybe a virtual server called org server 01, and then that sits on hardware that's a virtual server host. Kind of going along, file sharing, maybe that's your Windows file share, that's on a different server, and that's on a different physical host. Maybe you have a business process related to your CRM function, that's Salesforce, and that's out on the Salesforce cloud, and you don't have to necessarily worry about hardware. So this, I think, shows you a way to look at all of the components that are involved in that application stack. Obviously, this doesn't show any potential interactions. Perhaps there's yet another business process or a function that links your CRM with your email system. And so if you're thinking that an upgrade or change to your email platform might be in place, well, then it's important to look at all of the contingent or tied platforms, so that if your email moves from your on-site Exchange server to Office 365, for example, you're able to still meet that same business process, but may require some changes, a new connector, a new service, something to tie those pieces together. So this is a great way to just start to map out and identify all the different things and start to look at the interconnectedness of the systems. And I think particularly as we're seeing the shift from all the IT resources sitting in the server down the hall to different applications and services being introduced into the organization as part of various hosted cloud services, keeping something like this up to date can be important in just tracking your overall IT infrastructure, so that you can understand, oh yes, well yes, we have we're using Salesforce as our CRM, and then we're using Vertical Response for our messaging, and then that syncs up with our Google Apps account, but then we're also doing some document management, and help to just understand and keep all those interconnected systems aware of them, so that whenever the person who manages your Salesforce system leaves the organization, there's some degree of understanding of all of the the different constellation of services that are tied into that. So now that we have gone through, we have our strategic organizational plan, we have our strategic technology plan, we have a good framework of what our policies are in place, we understand how our organization is going to grow, we understand how all of those IT systems are tied together. I think the proverbial rubber meets the road whenever we start talking about the budget. And for the budgeting, I like to use a framework called Run, Grow, Transform. And basically, it means you can divide up your IT budget into these 3 different categories that really reflect on and touch on different kind of functional areas in the organization. So Run would be those kind of IT operational expenses, kind of year in, year out, they're fairly consistent. Grow would be those things that provide, perhaps like an incremental improvement, an IT, some type of a migration project, new server upgrade, the cost for a new phone system, something that's going to give you some, additional capacity for your organization. And then finally, Transform. And this is a bucket where you can put those, IT projects that, provide significant additional capacity to the organization. So it could be, shifting from, those in-house spreadsheets that you're using to manage your contacts to an organizational CRM. And so now, instead of doing, multiple data entry, you're doing a single, have a single data entry point, you have a single reporting point, you're able to really streamline your business process. What used to take, a week to do, now you can do it in an hour. And so that, shows up in that framework. And so again, the way that this can look in a spreadsheet form is this. You look at your, you have your run, your operational expenses, you have your grow expenses, you have your transform expenses. And I like to look at this over a 5-year period, primarily because you get to see the cost of your initial investment, whether that be, in a new server, a new service, new workstations, new hardware, whatever that may be. But then you also get to see, what does that cost look like whenever it's time to replace those assets, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Because I think the 3-year budget is great, but I think it has the potential to underestimate the total cost of ownership for some of these major IT system improvements. So and I think particularly as we're doing a lot of comparison between, kind of the traditional capital improvement technology with, minor ongoing costs to, these, lower upfront costs, but perhaps higher ongoing costs, software as a service solutions. This can help, potentially level the playing field and give you a better understanding of the IT costs. One thing this doesn't necessarily do is help to inform, things that you may call business agility, or the ability to kind of quickly respond and react and grow. So this isn't a very fluid or nimble process, but I think it's a good place to start so that 5 years is certainly a long time in IT years, but I think it's a good starting point to help estimate some of those costs moving forward. So again, we can fill this out and have some examples. So as I said, in our run category, well, we know, we're going to need internet, and that's going to be the same thing. And, hey, maybe, we know in year 3 we're going to, make a larger investment because, we're going to have another office that we're going to open up. Same thing, you could look at software costs, your hardware costs. In this case, let's say this is a 10-person organization. They're going to buy 10 new laptops in year 1. So that's at $1,200 a pop, that's a $12,000 expense. Hey, they don't have to spend any money, on that hardware year 2 and 3. But in year 4, it's going to be time to replace those laptops. So there's another $12,000. Same thing, with email. We can see, maybe email, you have that on premise. Maybe that costs you, $1,200 a year for various, support and maybe software licensing. But then in year 2 and 3, that's going to drop, because if we go down into our grow category, we see that we're going to do an Office 365 project, and that's going to allow us to reduce that cost. And so we're going to go from Office 365, we're going to go to Office 365, and then that's going to reduce our email costs moving forward to just the E3 licensing. And again, services, this can be, placeholder. And then as you see, we go down into the grow categories. Perhaps there's a website redesign, $20,000 in year 3. And hey, we know this upcoming year we're going to make a big investment in our CRM that's going to fundamentally transform it. We know we're going to have higher expenses ongoing with CRM updates in year 2, but that's going to taper off, year 3 and 4. So this can help you see how a project can, maybe start in the transform or grow area, and then shift into, the run stage as you get into a steady state. So it's just a framework for helping to understand the different technology investments that your organization is going to make, and how those costs add up over time.
I've got a quick question from the audience, Matt. A great question from Katie, and she asks, with technology pricing changing so much, how can you estimate 5 years down the road? It's hard for us to know what's going to happen with technology 2 years down the road, or even next year. What level of confidence can you have in the 5-year pricing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's not realistic perhaps to have your 5-year IT budget dollar-wise be exactly, or the buckets be exactly right. I think there is some sense that your IT budget, and maybe that's not represented here, but the totality of your IT budget is maybe I think it's going to stay more consistent year over year. I think with various N10 reports, they say, or they're showing that an organization's IT budget is around 3 to 6% of their overall revenue, and I think that can help put some parameters around maybe the hardware and software costs are going to change quite a bit, but that may be overtaken by maybe services are going to have an increase.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's
The other thing I would add to that is that this should definitely be thought of as a rolling budget.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you're redoing this every year, and the chances that when you get to year 5, it's going to look like what you put in the budget 5 years ago is unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of like you're walking down a path and it gets foggier, and foggier the farther out you look. But as you walk, it gets clearer as you get closer, and you just kind of want to have a general sense of where you're going, so you don't run off the road, I guess, to swing the analogy, past the breaking point. Do we have time for a quick poll? Just curious. Let's see. Well, we have 2 questions really related to budget. First of all, just want to know if you're currently working on your budget right now. I think I can watch that. Go. All right, we've got 50-50, and I think maybe the next poll will kind of go along with that first one. So just curious, when your calendar quarter, in what calendar quarter does your budget year start? So are you aligned with the calendar year? Do you have, does your fiscal year start in July? Does it start, are you on the federal calendar? Do you have an academic calendar year? And some of you may be asking, April? Whose fiscal year starts in April? We have a client whose fiscal year starts in April, so we know who they are because they're the only one. But it's possible. In fact, I always thought the fiscal year had to start on the same month as a calendar quarter, but our CFO Bill told me you could pick any month of the year, any day of the year to start your fiscal year on. So that was an eye-opener for me. So we got about a third, with the majority starting in July. So that's probably some of you working on your budget right now for July. Some of you may be starting on your budget already for October and the 4th quarter. And that's another thing I've noticed. I mean, I think the budget process really varies widely from organization to organization, as much as organizations change. One last thing I wanted to mention, the Run, Grow, Transform sort of methodology is one that we got from Donnie Shimamoto, and we've got a link that we'll be posting here to an essay he wrote back in 2011 kind of outlining this approach. And it's just a fantastic, probably one of the best, if not the best, articles I've ever read about IT budgeting. And I always try to check out his sessions at the N10 conference, follow him on Twitter. He's just definitely a thought leader in the world of IT planning and certainly IT budgeting. So thank you, Matt, for putting that up there. And I strongly encourage you all to check that article out, because it really goes into much greater detail on the Run, Grow, Transform. And I think another thing I really appreciate about Donnie and his work is that he's a CPA, so he kind of speaks that language, and it goes back to this idea of getting buy-in. And I don't speak that language, so I struggle a little bit when I'm trying to work with finance staff on budgeting and planning. And I think the more that I and all of us can learn to speak that language, the more effective we'll be in putting together good IT budgets. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some specifics. We're going to get back into a realm that we're more comfortable with here, which is the technology itself, and just kind of highlight some of the things that you should be thinking about as you're putting together an IT budget, stuff that sometimes falls through the cracks. You want to do this, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so in terms of your network, I mean, the network infrastructure is something that is often in a closet and not thought about. For our planning purposes, we typically this stuff has a 5-year lifespan for us, and then we like to have it replaced. I think in terms of IT planning, we're seeing much more emphasis on good wireless connectivity as organizations have more flexible workspaces. So I think the 5-year on the equipment, and definitely a preference for mobility. For servers, again 5-year life cycle on the actual physical equipment itself. Most everything that we're doing now is virtualization, if there is a on-site server at all, and we're certainly seeing some preference for moving servers to the cloud, although more often than not that's actually more of a software as a service as opposed to organizations spinning up their own servers in Amazon. Unless you have very specific requirements for having your servers at Amazon, it's you're better off either keeping something on site for kind of the basic connectivity, domain controller, login, that kind of thing, and then if you need an email solution, you're just going to be a lot better, a more flexible place to move that to to Google Apps or Office 365. So again, a lot of the the server stuff is certainly shrinking as the prevalence and kind of quality of solutions in the cloud continues to increase. Question about switches, 5 years is probably a reasonable estimate. It all depends on the quality. If you're investing in high-end Cisco stuff, 7 years might be reasonable, but 5 years I think is a safe planning bet.
I would add on switches, they go bad in mysterious ways, and when they do, it makes everyone's life miserable. So if you think the switch is basically the device that connects everything together, and if it goes bad, all of your connectivity goes bad. And sometimes they just fail outright, but more often than not, what happens is 1 or 2 ports will start acting crazy, and so it's the kind of thing where you may not even notice the problem at first, but then things slowly start to get worse, or it's a strange problem that's hard to troubleshoot. When something happens to a server, you kind of know it right away, and it's kind of obvious what it is, which is not great, but at least it's easy to troubleshoot. But with switches, they kind of lull you into a false sense of security because those lights keep blinking, and half the people in the organization are still getting on the network with no problems, but then you're starting to experience strange problems with other people. So I think as much as generally what I've found is that people are pretty disciplined about replacing their servers on a 5-year cycle, but they tend to kind of let the switches go. And I think it's important to just include the switches on the same cycle.
Great. For workstations, replace every 3 to 5 years. We're seeing laptops again, every 3 years. Workstations can usually go a little bit longer. People like to cascade them down to interns and volunteers. Certainly budget for e-cycling as well. Here in the DC area, we're very fortunate. There's a lot of different providers that are competing. So often you can find somebody who will come to your office, take the equipment off your hands. You may even get paid a little bit. So it's an easy way to make sure that equipment that may not be meeting your organization's needs anymore can help cannot end up in the landfill somewhere. I think what's not necessarily on here is on budgeting for as part of your BYOD policy and how that could impact your overall IT spend. One approach to take would be, for example, I saw that Citrix, as part of their BYOD policy, they gave their staff a choice of, we'll either provide you with a device and we'll support it, or we're going to give you, $2,500, every 3 years, and you can purchase your own. So that was one way that, a very big institution kind of went about their IT spend, and so they could they knew what their internal costs were to buy, support, and maintain, and then they also made that available for their employees as well.
One thing I would add on the workstations and laptops is we mentioned here align with your funding, and I think that can be a very effective way to replace workstations, but it can also be a dangerous approach. And this kind of goes back to the value of the Run, Grow, Transform 5-year budget, because oftentimes what can happen is an organization will get a big grant for a lot of machines that will replace all of the machines, and basically every machine in the organization will be brand new, and then 5 years down the road, all the machines are now needing to be replaced at the same time, and that grant is no longer there. And so you get to a point where there's just kind of, system-wide failure to some degree of all of the machines in an organization at once. And I think if at all possible, it's definitely more sustainable to put your workstations in the run row and basically replace a quarter of them every year, and so that you're replacing all of them every they have a 4-year lifespan. That can be financially challenging because workstations tend to be pretty expensive, especially for larger organizations. But I think in terms of long-term sustainability, that approach, then it's kind of guaranteed, it has a guaranteed source of funding from the organization, and you're not in year 6 or 7 with a bunch of workstations that don't work, trying to find grants to replace them. So I realize that's not always possible, but I think if I had to pick a method for funding workstations, I'd definitely pick a run, annual renew of a quarter of the inventory.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Moving on, we have just about 10 minutes left, and I appreciate the questions that have been coming in. So again, a plug, if you have any questions or comments or kind of best practices that you've picked up, please feel free to chat them in or use the question box. Software, again, you're looking at hosting locally, migrate to the cloud, what are those initial costs, what are the ongoing costs, the routine upgrades, again, your server OS, your Office version, I think we're certainly seeing the trends of things moving from that, capital expense to recurring fee. And, I think that, on the one hand, I think can be helpful for IT budgeting, at the same time, for an organization that's maybe used to getting that big grant, making a big purchase and then not having any IT expenses, it's a difficult shift to, kind of pay for things on that ongoing monthly recurring basis. So, I think this is an area where the IT funding and, needs to evolve and is evolving to pay for that ongoing support and maintenance versus, these kind of big capital purchases from time to time. And, Microsoft with their Office 365 program, the charity program going to, what we're seeing is free for E1 and $5 a month for E3, which is, it's nice. It includes, Office licensing for multiple devices, among some other features. But it's funny at the same time, we'll have organizations say, well, I can buy Office for, $30 from TechSoup. Why would I spend, $60 a year, for the foreseeable future for, to get it as part of Office 365? So, I think those are the decisions that we're seeing more and more often. For backups, the model, if it's on premise, it's likely easy to see and easy to back up. But it's also something as you're moving data out to the cloud, is that hosted service, does its kind of internal backup system meet your business requirements? How easy is it to recover from a bad data import or some other type of failure? So it's important, just because your data is in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically and magically backed up to your expectations. So that's an important thing to identify and plan.
For example, you may or may not know this, but Google, at least when I checked last month, and things changed pretty rapidly at Google, their official policy was that we might be able to recover your data within 5 days. So if you accidentally delete a user account and all the email and files associated with it, if you accidentally delete a bunch of emails, let us know right away. And there's a possibility that if it's within 5 days, we might be able to recover it. Now that's a recovery point objective and retention time that might not be acceptable to a lot of organizations. So there are a lot of third-party services that have sprung up to kind of address that gap by basically, it's another cloud, hosted provider that essentially backs up your Google Apps domain with a much higher retention, with specialized tools that allow you to restore in a more granular way. So like Matt said, just because you moved out to the cloud doesn't mean that all of your problems have gone away. In fact, to some degree, you need to be more diligent than in the past because, if you have a variety of clouds, let's say on Salesforce and Google Apps, and you have, Razor's Edge hosted, they probably all have different approaches to backup. You need to make sure you know what they are. And if they're not sufficient for your organizational needs, then you need to kind of supplement them with third-party services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Antivirus, kind of, in the same category. You obviously, need to protect the local system. Email and web filtering can also be in that bundle. And I think, there's an area where we see, there's some, synergy, so to speak. If, for example, if you've been paying for Postini with your local Exchange server, now potentially you're moving that to Office 365. Well, since you've done your enterprise architecture and you understand all the things that are tied in, well, now perhaps you can consolidate and see if the built-in anti-spam from Office 365 meets your needs, and if not, you can add on something later. But I think again here it's good to understand all the different services that you have in use, understand how they're interrelated, and just make sure that you're not necessarily paying twice for the same thing if something can already meet your requirements. And then also back up your passwords. Again, a lot of this is hosted services. It's important to make sure that somebody has all the keys to the castle if for all these different services that are in use at your organization.
And I would add that we're starting to see as you all know, the nature of IT is changing dramatically right now. Cloud is just kind of one side of it, one manifestation of it. But because it's changing so rapidly, there are a whole lot of new solutions that are starting to emerge. So one of the big areas is cloud brokers, and that's basically you go to a single site, single management console, and it would connect you to all of the different cloud services your organization is using. And that's a great way of kind of managing that. In some cases, it allows you to manage those costs, manage security credentials. So that's a newly emerging field. I don't think we certainly don't have any recommendations. I'm not sure how mature that field is yet, but that's coming. And as more organizations and small nonprofits start to host more of their information in the cloud, those sorts of services are going to start becoming more popular and important as well. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll certainly be keeping an eye on it also.
Great. So moving along, understand your ongoing contracts. What's the contract and renewal process? Particularly with a lot of these services. Most things that we're seeing, most ISP-related stuff and some phone stuff is a 2 or 3 year purchase with a annual auto renew, or sometimes a 3 year auto renew. It's just kind of all over the map, but it's very important to I think we're moving from IT as a on-premise kind of trust resource to you're purchasing you're basically contracting with somebody to get a service. So the contracting nature of IT, I think, becomes much more important. So reading the fine print on all the contracts and renewals is very critical to understanding your overall IT support and management costs. So we're winding down our time here, but we should have put the people component first, since technology is while it's fun to have all the whiz-bang toys, at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, people are what is going to make it work. So understanding your IT support costs related to your in-house staff, volunteers, your outsourced providers, training, the IT acceptable use policy. These are all components that kind of get rolled into what it means to have an effective IT strategy.
All right, so that pretty much does it. That we reached the end of the webinar. We appreciate everyone attending. We've got another webinar coming up. I'll be presenting kind of a rundown, really, of bring your own device sort of a state of the bring your own device. I'm going to be looking at some large companies and the wide, variety of policies they've adopted for BYOD, and talk about some of the legal and information security implications of different approaches to BYOD. So it's really kind of just here's where things stand right now. Here's some things to look forward to in the future. So I look forward to that, and I hope you can join us for that. As always, we appreciate your feedback. So please, provide that in the survey that we send out, and you can download these slides as well as the recording of the webinar later on today and tomorrow. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions in here, so we're going to leave the webinar up for another minute or two while we respond to these questions. And for the rest of you, feel free to drop out, and we thank you very much for your time, and hope you have a good day. Take care.